Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing from. Thank you for joining today's session. This is the 8th chapter in our Knowing Your Assets Value series. Today, we're going to talk about managing the politics of your forecast. As part of that, we'll address the strategic question of how do I manage upward pressure on the revenue while also ensuring an achievable forecast. My name is Jeff Olive. I'm the founder and CEO of P3I Consulting. And again, I'd like to welcome you. A couple of quick housekeeping notes for today. The session is being recorded for future playback, and there will be time for a brief Q&A at the end. So just a little bit about P3I Consulting and what we do. We specialize in using financial models to enable decision-making in spaces that range from BD&L to launch forecasting all the way through strategic planning. We believe the benefits of working with us are that we'll help you clearly articulate the economic value of your clinical and commercial strategy. We also believe you'll have a deeper understanding of the market and product landscape, as well as drivers of the commercial opportunity. In terms of services we provide, there's three core pillars. Obviously, financial modeling is one. Pillar number two relates to analytics that we do to inform forecasting and plan for future uncertainties, manage portfolio prioritization, and those sorts of things. Pillar number three is a broad services category that spans anything from training to objective assessment of capabilities to capabilities building all the way through process redesign. Just a little bit about me. I've been in the industry for over 20 years. Prior to founding P3I, I was at a biotech startup called EQRX. While I was there, I worked on launch sequencing work as well as infrastructure builds so we could plan for which countries we would launch different products in to maximize certain objectives that we had. I also worked on TPPs to inform clinical trial design and come up with a TPP that would maximize our opportunity. Prior to that, I was at Merck for many, many years, but perhaps most notably, I built their global oncology forecast capabilities from the ground up. Obviously, that was for Keytruda, and we did everything from the forecast models all the way through assumptions development, all the way through business decisions. So back to today's strategic question. Again, it is how do I manage pressure to show revenue targets while ensuring an achievable forecast? So in terms of the areas of pressure, I've broken this up into three categories. These are optimistic assumptions, fixed dollar targets, and pessimistic assumptions. So when we think of optimistic assumptions, we're often working with personalities that are risk averse. And sometimes this comes across maybe as someone who's overconfident, or maybe there's just an underestimation of competitive pressures. That can happen. Another thing that can happen is there's just limited evidence that's been generated to date to support a particular forecast. And when that happens, what you're left with is judgment. And if you've been in this game as long as I have, when it comes to judgment, usually the person at the top of the food chain, their judgment tends to prevail. So that's why it's important to go through today's exercise and develop some tools that can help you overcome some of these judgmental judgment calls that are made. The other thing that can happen related to optimistic assumptions is people are trying to achieve a political agenda. And Usually, this comes in one of two forms. There's an interest in showing high revenues to get an expense budget that is deemed necessary for a successful launch. Or sometimes there are arms races for business development deals, and there's a desire to close that deal and to take on a lot of risk, hoping that it becomes worthwhile after the deal is closed. A third area where you'll see this happen is with investor expectations. Investor relations is great at getting models that the sell side analysts use. And oftentimes, these sell side analysts have actually a pretty wide range on what their revenue expectations could be for an asset. But if the internal team is coming in significantly below that range of analyst expectations, there's often a lot of questions about why that is. And so that will come across oftentimes as an upward pressure on the forecast. In terms of fixed dollar targets, usually the message behind this is from people in the organization who need to hit a particular revenue objective. And this is almost always an increase in the forecast. I've never really seen someone come back to me and say you have to decrease the forecast by, this much to get to a certain revenue target. Usually the pressure is in the upwards direction. And reason for that is usually there's an expected budget gap that needs to be closed. That could be for a product, a business unit, or even the entire company. And so usually what happens is maybe after a first round of valuations, there's a second round where the objective is put forward and you're asked to find a way to close that revenue gap. The challenge with these type of pressures is they're not linked to assumptions. And that makes it a little bit more difficult sometimes to manage, but we'll work you through how to deal with that. And then, of course, there's pessimistic assumptions. Now, a lot of times we do refer to these people as sandbaggers, but on an altruistic note, there are situations when perhaps there's just very intense competitive pressure. And gauging the extent of the impact of that pressure can actually be very difficult. And so that causes pause for these leaders as they're going through evaluation process. There are also times maybe where these leaders have some question marks about just how compelling phase 3 data will be. And maybe they have certain insights that someone on a valuation team might not see. Maybe they've talked to one of the investigators or been at an advisory board, and questions have been posed that are giving them second thoughts. And so before they take on an objective that's insurmountable, they want to make sure appropriate thought has been given to that. But if we take away those altruistic motives, yes, there are folks that I'm sure we've all worked with that really just are finding a way to make sure they hit the sales target. So in general, you're going to find pressure upwards and downwards on the forecast. And I would say, regardless of the motives, our goal is to do one of three things, sometimes all three. Focus on the assumptions, stay within the realm of possibility, and show the risk and opportunity. And here we want to be very transparent, obviously. We have a number of analytical tools and resources at our disposal. And what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about managing the realm of possibility. And I think it's important when we talk about the realm of possibility to be a little bit humble in how we define how big or how narrow that can be. We've all seen forecasts that have really exceeded expectations, and that would be everybody's expectations. And we've also seen products that really missed expectations. So we have to be a little bit humble in just how good our crystal balls are when we think about that realm of possibility. And that's why it's important to think of a realm of possibilities versus something like a most likely assumption. And that's oftentimes where we get pigeonholed in these conversations, is on that most likely assumption versus the realm of possibility. So 5 things to think about as you're debating what that realm of possibility is, and maybe where that most likely scenario should fit in, because that most likely scenario is what's going to give people pause in terms of the amount of risk that they're taking on in that objective. So we've spent in this series time talking about evidence to support a forecast. And just to be very clear about this, sometimes just putting real bookends on how wide that could be, and not getting so caught up in everything else can be extremely helpful in just taking away some of the anxiety about the forecast and getting caught up in that most likely scenario. That said, by all means, please work with analogs. We've talked about how to work with imperfect analogs. We've talked about how to work with market research that may need to be dampened, but use all the evidence you can. And sometimes don't be afraid just to focus on the bookends so that people just get a comfort level with, how big or how small we're defining it. Sometimes that's a really good first step. Sometimes the evidence for specific assumptions is not that great. And an alternative, which many companies use, is just to look at benchmarks. What are sales of competitive products? What are analysts saying? And that'll give you a perspective on the range that you're working with as well. And frankly, sometimes just comparing where you are to those benchmarks, and whether you're to the right-hand side of that or to the left-hand side of that, will give people a really good perspective. Another opportunity when there's, less and less evidence, is to have frameworks. So order of entry is something we've talked about in the series as well. And that works well for brands as well as it does for new classes. Obviously, the more choices there are, typically the more pressure on share that can be applied. But there are other things that you might want to factor in, like different ways to promote the product and different levels of access that products may have. You might need to think about that, especially access in the US can be different with medical reimbursement versus claims that go through a pharmacy benefits manager. If you're competing in a market where some products get reimbursed through medical benefits and other products get reimbursed through pharmacy benefits, that can create a real thought challenge that you'll have to work through. So in terms of limiting specificity, this is something else that I kind of alluded to earlier with that most likely scenario. I do find that when we're thinking of a most likely scenario, oftentimes people get to a level of precision that's maybe just too precise, 23% or 55, 56, 57, 8%, those sorts of things. If you can work in multiples of 5 to provide ranges, I think that actually lends a level of credibility to the forecast, because nobody really believes that we're that precise where we can say something is, 66.6% share. But as part of that, also make sure you shave off some of those extremities. And another great analytical tool, though it's a little bit more sophisticated and it takes a certain amount of education for people, is Monte Carlo analysis. And specifically what I'm thinking of here is 2 things. One, there could be tornado charts that are generated, where you just show how sensitive a model is to a particular assumption or a series of assumptions. And that helps people really think through the range of a forecast. The other thing that comes out of Monte Carlo analysis is a cumulative distribution function. And that's another great tool to show exactly how much risk is embedded in a most likely forecast and how you might want to set that most likely forecast. One way to think about it is to set the most likely forecast maybe near that 50th percentile. So you have an equal chance of going over or going under the forecast. Some might say that's not enough, stretch in the objective. So maybe you want to go to like a 66 or 75 percentile, but you can work through that. Another way to think about the level of risk in a forecast is just to be very transparent in terms of the assumptions and the revenues. So if we look on the bottom, we have, 3 different assumptions here. And we see for those, maybe on some finance is high and finance is low relative to our colleagues in marketing. And we can be very clear that for whatever reason, there's a disagreement in what those assumptions should be. But you can always translate that to a revenue range. And this becomes really interesting because in this particular scenario, what we've seen is finance is actually a little bit ambitious in assumptions 1 and 3. But yet, when we put that into the model, we're seeing finance still comes out with a relatively low forecast. Well, what does that suggest? It suggests that assumption number 2 is really what's driving the forecast. And so you can have a very robust discussion on just that one topic and work through how you want to manage that. What we'd also say is showing different scenarios about how the market may play out differently becomes very useful. And in that case, you're not always worried about the specific scenario. You're worried about something more high level, about things that could go our way, things that could work against us, unexpected outcomes. And that also helps you bookend the forecast. But going back to the prior slide with just some of those underlying motivations, if you're aware of what those motivations are, that will help you message throughout this journey. So we've talked about the upward pressures on the forecast and to some degree downwards, managing fixed dollar targets. That again tends to be an upward pressure. 2 pieces of advice in broad buckets here. One, again, if possible, always try to come back to an assumption. That said, think about how big this target is and if it falls within the realm of possibility and where it falls within the realm of possibility. Is this something that is on that far right-hand end of the spectrum where everything has to go your way? Or is it maybe just a minor adjustment because for whatever reason, something's not captured by the model? Those situations where it's just something minor are relatively easy to work through. But again, if you can depict this along a spectrum of uncertainty and help people understand just how much risk is being contemplated, that might give people some pause as to, what that objective should be. Another thing that you might want to consider is just being transparent about what that judgment is. And we've talked about that patient funnel many times in this series before. And we start at the very top, obviously, with something like a prevalence or incidence. We work through the patient acquisition all the way to patient monetization. And usually we leave it there. But what has been a really good tool for me in some situations is to just insert at the bottom of this a row for judgment. Maybe it's not always worth going through all the modeling rigor to close that revenue gap. And we just say, you know what, we're off by X amount of dollars. And we don't know exactly how we're going to get this, but we're going to take it on as a risk. And at least you're being transparent that risk may not be achievable. And that gives the leaders who need to make business decisions about that, I think, some useful information as well. Another tool in the armamentarium is to be clear about the implications of potential bias. Again, this just helps give people some pause as they're thinking through how much risk they want to take on as they're making a particular decision. And so there's three buckets here to maybe manage some optimism or pessimism. In terms of supply, um, when the forecast is wrong, obviously it can affect things like expenses, patients, or even your own product use and adoption. So people are generally aware of this, but sometimes it's just helpful to call it out that, if we make too much, we risk high discard rates. Or maybe there's a high inventory carrying cost, and that's going to impact our working capital. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of that. And likewise, sometimes they just needed to be reminded if we come up with something that's too late, there could be delayed orders. We may run out of product and not, supply the market adequately. And of course, when that happens, that stifles product use and that can be unrecoverable. So that would be a big risk that most people would want to avoid. Terms of people, there could be some retention impacts here, and we've worked through this in my lifetime where if there is an optimistic bias, you might get people burned out trying to keep up with all the work, or especially on the sales side, trying to hit like a revenue target that's just unachievable. Sometimes they'll leave the company, or maybe they'll also promote other products in the bag to make sure that they're netting out to a sales objective that they can live with. Also, some people read into the forecast. If they think it's way low, they might start questioning whether there's layoffs, and you could risk losing some really good talent with that. And of course, there's the impact of credibility and how you're managing expectations, and not just your own company, but also the investor community. And you have to worry about how much people will weigh your opinion if you're not seen as credible in this area. Um, and then another way to think through this as you're going through some of those objectives is sometimes there are longer term impacts beyond the budget period. And so that's another way to ground people in just how much risk you might want to take on. And then I think another great way to just routinely address these biases, because we know they're out there, they always were, and they probably always will be. Let's start thinking about systems we can put in place um, so that it doesn't become as much of a pressure point as it may the first time around. And so transparency tends to be, one of my favorite friends in these exercises. And so one great tool that's out there is just to create a series of standard templates that depict, where you're coming in at with particular assumptions relative to that overall range of uncertainty. And sometimes what you can do is be very clear about assumptions that can be shaped versus others that can't be shaped. So, maybe something like a market size that's very difficult to shape versus a market share. So maybe you want to be more ambitious on the assumptions that you can shape and less ambitious on the ones you can't shape. Like I mentioned before, I think creating placeholders for judgment can be very healthy. It saves a lot of time for people doing the modeling, and I think it leads to very healthy discussion on how much risk is being applied in that judgment row. And track that over time. There is something called forecast value add. Many companies track that, and that is specifically to measure that judgment and how good it is. And there have been cases where judgment's absolutely been needed and makes the forecast more accurate. And there are obviously the reverse of that, where judgment has made the forecast less accurate. So good tool to use. Obviously, after launch, there's many great KPIs that come out of the forecast. So not only do you track your overall performance, but also make sure you're tracking performance on individual assumptions. Not only does that lead to a learning exercise, but can also help you activate different marketing levers and potentially grow your business if you're falling short in some of those assumptions. And of course, always create mechanisms to learn. Um, None of us are perfect. These are usually large cross-functional teams that we're working in. So always debrief after you're doing like a business development deal or a planning and budgetary cycle. And what you're going to want to look for is things that went really well that you want to continue, things maybe that didn't go well, you want to stop or change. And of course, maybe some things you just completely missed that you want to start. And of course, always discuss ways to minimize bias. So that takes us pretty much to the end of today's session. Just some closing thoughts. Again, managing politics is usually focused on optimistic and pessimistic points of view and giving people the information they need to make the decisions that need to be made. Um, I am a big fan of transparency and using that as a tool to manage uncertainty. And again, just be clear on the level of risk that we think is embedded in a particular valuation. I find that just showing high and low bookends, sometimes simple tools like that make all the difference in getting people comfortable with a particular forecast and maybe why you settled somewhere in between. But I think it's also fair to address what some of those biases are and what the consequences of those biases are. Like, hey, if we really go in this direction, we risk the stock out, or we risk some discards, that sort of thing. Some of those discards, depending on some of these products, can be very expensive. And again, the more you can systematize this, the better off you'll be, because then this all becomes routine and it's not considered a unique situation. It's something that's planned for, it's something that's accounted for, people know it's coming. That takes us to the Q&A session for today. And there is a Q&A button. You're welcome to use that. For me, it's at the top of the screen. I do have a couple of questions that came in advance. This one is, how do I stop leaders from routinely overestimating the value of their portfolio? And I think what I'm going to key in here is on that word routinely. If someone's overestimating routinely, I kind of wonder why they're overestimating on a routine business. Are they right? Is that possible? Are they hitting the forecast? And if that's true, then maybe they're not really overestimating the value. And of course, if they are routinely overestimating the value, then why is there not a learning process built in that says, hey, we've had this level of discards, or we missed objectives by this amount? Something in that process might be able to be tweaked a little bit so that there's feedback to start getting back to a forecast that's more achievable. And then the second question I have is, how can you negotiate the adoption of more realistic assumptions? And I think it's this idea of negotiating realistic assumptions. We talked about that continuum of uncertainty and how much risk you want to take on. So I think bookending that realm of possibility is really helpful, and guiding people towards one end of the spectrum or the other, and highlighting, if we're all the way to the right, then there's no cushion, and that could be a lot of risk for this particular exercise, whether it's a BD deal or just one of the budget cycles where you could end up missing your objective. So if there are no more questions, that does take us to the end of today's session. This was actually the last webinar in our series. We thank you for tuning in. We hope you found it insightful. And please stay in touch with us through our website. We do routinely post there. We're also on LinkedIn and post there as well. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.